Most people of conscience have been disgusted and offended by the recent stage of the saga involving the Jeffrey Epstein case, where the Department of Justice recently released a memo which essentially denied the existence of an Epstein client list and also tried to say that Jeffrey Epstein did not off himself. But many people are taking the perspective and framing this issue within a context of elite power or the sort of two-tier system of justice. But few people are actually understanding the significance of this issue. So in this video, my friends, I'm going to explore how the Epstein saga demonstrates how political deceit and the concept of political deceit remains an enduring foe to good governance, and how the noble lie fits into how sometimes our statesmen will try to act when it comes to distributing power. And I will do this by evaluating the history of ideas and then giving us a blueprint rooted in the moral law out of this crisis. Before we get into that, my friends, I hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our message and our project, most importantly, is successful. My friends, this is a civic conservative project. If you are someone that believes in the eternal truths of the American experiment, if you are someone that believes in the foundations that made our country a rather novel and assertive force in the stream of history, and you wish to preserve those things and fight for those things fiercely in the public discourse, this channel is where you need to be. This project is where you need to be. And I would appreciate greatly your likes, your shares, your comments. And if you are so moved, I would appreciate your donations. Of course, you are under no obligation to do so, but it always helps. Thank you guys so much for being here. Now, please enjoy the video. So, I will not be restating the entire Epstein saga in this video. Many of you have favorite content creators you can go to get a restatement of all the basic facts. But in the interest of being thorough, I will mention some very basics of the case that would lead a reasonable person to assume that cover-up and deceit is happening here. Jeffrey Epstein, as many of you know, was both a sort of high society socialite and an individual who was connected with a lot of people, some of which we already know, like Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew, and even people that are beyond that list who he simply was casual friends with, allegedly. And he ran a sex trafficking operation which involved minors, and of course involved his famous plane called the Lolita Express, where allegedly many minors flew on it and went to his island where bad things happen. And there's a lot of intrigue and mystery surrounding Epstein, surrounding his connections. There's allegations that he is a foreign asset. There's been speculations that he was actually not a foreign asset, but actually a domestic asset that was used to collect blackmail. There's a lot of speculations. But one thing is clear, given the current state of the empirical record, was that this person had access to the highest levels of society. But not only that, but he also had proximity to people who would have a lot to lose if he were to expose, or if his affiliation with them were to be exposed to the public, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people thought his death was oddly suspicious. Not only that, but his death coincides with a sort of suspicious alteration of the lockdown timelines. It was alleged that he was in his cell at a particular time when he passed away. But in all reality, that timeline has been scrutinized, and it was revealed that he was actually not in his cell at the time that people said he was. So there's also intrigue around if he actually was where he was at the time of his passing away. A lot of different things. So a reasonable person who takes the facts and then uses the facts to try to form some kind of conclusion would be led to believe that this person, if all of this stuff is true, and there is good reason to believe that it is true, obviously was a very sensitive individual to a lot of people, and obviously had implications and connections within political and general society. Now, the entire thrust of that premise is being doubted by a lot of the influencer class, people that really just make me sick to my stomach. And by the way, on this channel, as I've said before, great minds talk about ideas, Smaller average minds obsess over people because people are limited, ideas are eternal, and you're right, an idea can stretch your mind towards different conclusions than more than a particular person will. So I won't mention any names, but there have been several prominent individuals within the influencer class that has called any attempt to brand Epstein as a connection with the people in high society or to claim there's a cover-up as mere speculation, and have even decided to say that any information about the Epstein case outside of what the Department of Justice stated, i.e. there's no list, and also that there was no cover-up for his death, is mere conspiratorial musing, and it has no basis in fact. Which is very interesting because these personalities, some of whom consider themselves to be quite intellectual, have not been able to distinguish between speculation and induction. You see, when you induct a particular conclusion for something, you look at the facts as they are, and you draw forth from those facts a general assumption. Whenever you use induction, you're not always going to be 100% right. In fact, whenever you have the established facts, facts can be opened up to correction in the future. Facts themselves are not settled truths. They're the best truths that we know at the time. So, but speculation, however, is this sort of groundless going about of understanding issues that it is rooted in nothing more than the fancies of the mind. Funnily enough, the very influencers who are saying that we should only believe what the current administration is telling us about this case, they're the ones who are speculating because their approach to this issue is not grounded in anything except a kind of blind trust to those in authority for the fact that they are in authority, nothing else. And authority is not intelligible insofar as it does not inherently confer truth. Truth confers power upon authority. So the speculative ones are the ones who are so eager to believe the official narrative about this. They are the ones who are so eager to dismiss any attempt at induction. They are the ones who are so eager to have no foundation in their knowledge. And those are the people that I think ought to be embarrassed to even show their face on a camera or even show their face in public discourse. But that's a different matter for a different time. Speaking of authority, given the fact that all of these circumstances exist and they align as they do, we should really ask ourselves, why in the world are things being withheld? Why in the world is there an air of deceit around this matter? And I think the approach to the current administration coincides with the functional use of the concept of the noble lie, which I'll explore in a second. But before I do that, I must explain why I believe it coincides with it. When this issue was talked about on the campaign trail before President Trump won his second term, President Trump was pretty adamant that he would actually go ahead and release information. When he got into office, he became very wishy-washy about it and even said, well, a lot of innocent people might be implicated. Pam Bondi was pretty adamant that she had the access to the files that people were requesting. But then a little bit after that, Pam Bondi said that she can't release more information because of national security concerns. Then after that, a memo comes out that says there is no information to release. Obviously, this is a practice in deceit. But why would they be trying to deceive us? Well, the idea of the noble lie is that sometimes mistruths and falsehoods are actually beneficial to the people. The idea comes from Plato. And in the Republic, Plato had this conception, this distinction between an imitation lie and a true lie. Now, without going into the metaphysics of all of it, I'll explain very briefly. Plato believed that a true lie damages the soul of a person, and it can never be adhered to. But an imitation lie is not really going to damage somebody who is not attuned to the truth already, because an imitation lie is not a real lie. And Plato believed that the populace actually needed to be fed imitation lies because they couldn't fully grasp the truth. Some people are so low on the totem pole, or their souls are so crushed and underdeveloped, according to Plato, that if you were to actually tell them the truth, they wouldn't understand. So to keep the society running, to keep the community running, Plato supposed that we actually have to have a kind of noble lie that goes towards the supposed good of the people, keeps them in their particular station in life, and keeps everything operating good. Now, but the philosopher king and the philosopher, they can't at all and entertain the noble lie, because the noble lie would ruin their ability, ruin their soul, because their soul is actually attuned to the truth in Plato's theory. So the philosopher king and the philosopher has to stand outside of the community, has to stand outside of civil society, has to look at it from up top of a mountain, and has to govern it with no intimate connection with the people for this reason. And that then gives him the ability to know things and to say things that the rest of the people, according to this theory, are not allowed to know or allowed to say. Now, this idea develops throughout political history. And Machiavelli, in The Prince, in chapter 18 of The Prince, he goes on and talks about why it is practical. He doesn't necessarily tie it to the soul. He ties it to the preservation of the ruler's power. Why it is practical for the ruler to go ahead and lie. Machiavelli says, for example, and I quote, "Everyone admits how praiseworthy it is for a prince to keep his word, and to behave with integrity rather than cunning. Nevertheless, our experience has been that those princes who have done great things have considered keeping their word of little account, and have known how to beguile man's minds by shrewdness and cunning." Means lying, means being slick with how you lie. I'm sure we know people that are like that these days, don't we? In the end, he goes on to say, these princes have overcome those who have relied on keeping their word. For Machiavelli, it was important for the prince to have the appearance of transparency, the appearance of honesty, but the substance of someone who deceives, because for Machiavelli, deceit preserves power. And the preservation of power, just like for Plato, the preservation of political order and the good of the community are the objects of political order. Well, the problem with Plato is that he has a very narrow view of man. He does not understand that truth, rather than being resident to the elite part and the knowing part of society, is actually important for all of us to understand if we are to live a life of moral responsibility. And Machiavelli didn't consider the ethics of power really beyond preserving it or beyond using it to crush foes. He simply considered it in terms of how to maintain hold of it. But the ethics of power go way beyond maintaining it, and they ought to be ordered by the pursuit of good governance, because where good governance is absent, tyranny is not only present, but tyranny and the collapse of social order, which political order is meant to guard, also unleashes and has absolutely no barrier at all to stop it. And so I believe the approach this administration is taking, the government is taking right now, to the Epstein case is the quintessential noble lie. We have seen several times people say that we can't release certain kinds of information because it'll affect person X, Y, and Z. Some people have even speculated that if we release certain kind of information, it'll crash the markets. A lot of people are saying that it would actually just upend and destroy our ability to trust anyone that leads certain institutions or to trust institutions in general. So the entire idea is that for the good of the people and also for the good of those in power and also for the good of the norms of power, some things ought not to be revealed. But my friends, we have to understand, the moment you understand where the legitimacy for political order comes from, which is the consent of the government, not only the consent of the government, but also comes from the station that political order has to be constrained by natural first principles, without which it tends towards destruction rather than tending towards its proper role as a guardian. The moment you understand this is the moment any kind of noble lie or any kind of fixation upon power must become disabused, because these things tend towards the destruction of society rather than actually tending towards the betterment of society. But even that, we oftentimes have this conception of the good. This ought to be done because it will increase the beneficial ratio in this particular area. But what about the right? What is right and what is wrong does not change with the passage of time, does not change with the building of consensus, does not change with how rulers wish to actually govern. The demands of truth and justice as dominant principles go beyond and outrank the consideration that we ought to have for those who may be embarrassed by their association with someone who harmed children, which the most vulnerable people in a society whom we are to protect. Because if we don't protect children, we can't protect the future. We can't protect the future, we can't even ensure our own existence. It violates the principle of self-preservation, and yet we sit here making excuses for things that clearly go against basic understandings of how this ought to happen. This also has to do with unchecked power, my friends. The nature of an unchecked power, when it is not informed by good governance, goes to some very morally fraught places because it leads rulers to not consider how their power can have an effect beyond particular areas. You see, when you have a statesman that considers the role his power has, being affixed towards a particular goal, being affixed towards a particular moral purpose, their focus will be on that particular goal, or that particular moral focus. But the moment power becomes unreleased from any kind of restraint of conscience, and instead becomes governed by the restraints of practicality, who will this affect? Who will this hurt? How will this look? We have an entire industry of people called political consultants who help politicians govern how things look. Even if the substance is nasty, they can make the substance go away by making the aesthetics look pleasing. The moment power becomes distinct from the things that actually make it justly ordered is the moment it becomes destructive to the people. The foundation of all politics, my friends, is good governance. And good governance, my friends, is not simply doing things that seem nice. Good governance is being constrained by the things that keep political order in check, and also constrained by the principles that allow society to exist in the first place. Without justice, we cannot have any sense of propriety for our contracts, our promises, or our property. All those things would be destroyed. Without veracity, truth, we cannot trust someone. And if the foundation of trust goes away, then we have no basis for our social relationships. We have no basis for anything. Everything just collapses. Without trust, you can't have fidelity. Fidelity is faith and loyalty to those who you know and those whom you're connected to. Without fidelity and faith and loyalty, you cannot even begin to cooperate at all. So many different things are required to ensure good governance. Good governance is a thing, and that includes an attempt to protect the elites. When it comes to high society, my friends, many of us understand that with more access and more resources, you can get away with more things. But good governance, being impartial rather than being partial, assures that this kind of thing shouldn't happen. But when power is unchecked by these ideas, then it becomes a handmaiden for those whose interests can be furthered by the bigger amount of resources that they most importantly have. We ought to consider the biggest risk of the whole Epstein thing. It's not just that justice will be not applied equally. It's not just that people will lose confidence in institutions. It's that good governance will be displaced by the noble lie. And the noble lie and its implications will create an ugly kind of political order that will not only get power further and further away from its proper place as the guardian of social order, but also make power, rather than being a corrective and guarding force, an active interventionist force in shaping the society. Power exists to preserve the society, but the moment power starts to shape the society is the moment that I can't really act in a way that is abiding by my conscience. I can't really act in a way that is elective of my will. And without having the ability of my will to be unimpeded to act in moral ways, I can't be morally responsible. And if I can't be morally responsible, that means my actions can't be, I can't right wrongs. I can't be awarded for my right. I can't do all these things collapse and they fall apart. This is the implication of this thing. Political deceit. I don't care how nice it is. I don't care how necessary it is deemed for the existence of a society. Political deceit violates first principles, and political deceit, most importantly, creates a precedent where a healthy and virtuous civil society is no longer possible, because it is not founded upon the things that make it possible in the first place. The only answer, the only just answer to this Epstein case is to have complete transparency, to ignore consequences, because by the way, a focus on consequences is a dead end in public ethics. To completely ignore the consequences and to simply say, if we are to have good governance, we must first have veracity. And if we already have veracity, we must first have transparency. And if transparency is to exist in a full way, transparency ought to be paired with accountability. And if accountability is to exist in a full way, accountability ought to be paired with justice. And if justice ought to be paired in a full way, no matter how rich you are, no matter how successful you are, no matter how smart you are, you ought to be held accountable for the wrongs you've done. And if this administration or any administration after it cannot countenance that, then as far as I understand, they are complicit in moral wrong, and they ought not get the patronage of any man of conscience, especially if they call themselves a conservative. To be a conservative is not simply to like tradition, like some people think it is. To be a conservative is to understand that first, conscience and the truths that flow from conscience are necessary for any society to exist and exist well. And the moment you violate those is the moment you upend any foundation for you to work off of. We need to ensure that this matter is handled in the right way, and held in the proper context. And most importantly, we need to ensure that the noble lie does not continue to have any legitimacy in our current political context. My friends, if this message touched you, if this message appealed to you, I would encourage you to join the Pensive cohort, which is a project I am starting that will reassert the first principles of the American experiment into the public discourse actively. I am looking for all kinds of people to join, especially if you are younger and you have a passion for philosophy and learning and history. You can join in the Discord link down below. I encourage you all to like, share, comment, subscribe, donate to me if you wish to help me continue to remain in doing content, because that helps me a lot. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain well convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.